Many people in the world today mistakenly blame capitalism for a lot of the problems we're seeing. And to clearly define the difference between capitalism and socialism, I like to approach it in a very primitive sense. So I say that the first man who spent his time, efforts, energy digging a hole into the ground to protect himself from the elements was actually the first capitalist, and that he was applying his labor to nature to reform it, to change it, to mold it to suit his needs, to satisfy his wants, his want to, say, take cover from the elements. And then he expended this time, effort, energy as an investment in the future. So he sacrificed his present for future enjoyment. And at the end of that process, was able to harvest the fruit of his own labor. So he was actually able to have a want satisfied as a result of his own labor. So that is a capitalist activity. Someone that spends their time, owns their time, harnessing and producing fruits of their labor that they can then harvest for themselves or trade with others. And I say that in this primitive sense, the first socialist was the man that violently encroached on the first capitalist's tiny territory to use it for his own selfish purposes. So the first guy that saw this, hardworking individual digging himself a hole to protect himself from the elements, this socialist actually intervened to confiscate that wealth for himself. So the difference there being, capitalism means you own and have the exclusive rights to trade the fruits of your own labor. Whereas at the opposite end of that spectrum, we would have socialism. That means other people, namely the state, in practice the state, would have a greater or lesser right to a portion of the fruits of your own labor. So in a purely capitalist society, self-owned people spend their time investing it as they want, creating goods, services, knowledge. They're then free to trade the fruits of those labor with other self-owned people that have done the same thing, and the net outcome of that is wealth generation, right? And trust established through trade networks. The opposite end of that, again, is socialism that actually seeks to siphon value from the wealth generated from capitalist activities. So the problem in the world today is not capitalism. Capitalism is actually the result of all the prosperity, the abundance of material wealth we mostly experience in the developed world. Whereas the true problem is at the heart of every quote unquote capitalist economy in the world today is an institution of socialism, which is the central bank. An institution that does not provide any value whatsoever to productive people, and in fact siphons value off of the economic surplus that they produce. So to quantify this socialistic model of money called central banking and actually calculate how many hours they have stolen from productive people, how much of that economic surplus they have harvested for themselves through fiat currency supply inflation, I prepared a proxy using a calculation from data provided by the Social Security Administration and the Federal Reserve here in the United States. And so what I did was I took each year's US M2 supply increase, so that's growth in the money supply, and divided it by the average annual wage rate as tabulated by the Social Security Administration to calculate a proxy for the total time stolen through US M2 supply expansion. So this is basically how many hours the Fed was printing, right? How many hours of labor were they irrigating themselves by manipulating the currency supply. And the figures come out to be truly startling. I looked at a period from 1981 to present, which is 2020. I annualized 2020 because we have some budgetary estimates from the United States Budget Office, and it's really some staggering figures. So it comes to an average of 7.6% working hours stolen per year since 1981. So for 40 years straight, the Fed has basically confiscated 7.6% of the economic output of dollar users. I guess here we're really focused on the United States, so this ignores international. This is the economic output of domestic producers using dollars. And again, if we assume, so that total figure is 7.6% working hours per year. The number is about 23.4 billion hours stolen per year. So after a 40-year period, it comes to a total of almost 1 trillion hours stolen through central banking. And if we take that figure and divide it by 2,000 average annual working hours per year, so each person on average works about 52 weeks, which is 2,080 hours less 2 weeks vacation. So it's about 2,000 hours per year, assuming you only take 2 weeks vacation and work 40 hours a year, or 40 hours a week. That total figure comes out, the Fed stealing 1 trillion hours or 23.4 billion hours per year translates to enslaving a workforce of 11.7 million people, or 11.7 million full-time equivalents at that 2,000 hour per year work rate for 40 years straight. So that's just to give you some sense of scale of how gigantic and monstrous the central banking institution of time theft has become. And as we mentioned earlier, it's growing at an accelerating rate. Again, in 2020, the USM2 growth rate has increased about 1,300% relative to the past 5 years. So it's getting worse. And I think people can sense that. So, Gandhi has a great quote on this. He says, quote, "Civil disobedience becomes a sacred duty when the state has become lawless or corrupt," unquote. And clearly, forcibly stealing people's time and labor and effort and energies and the fruits of their labor in the marketplace by manipulating the currency that they are forced to use is a direct violation of private property rights, which is at the substructure of capitalism, right? Capitalism itself is intended to be supported by rule of law, which is a nonviolent dispute resolution. It's intended to honor private property rights, which again, in the sense of that primitive capitalist digging that hole to protect himself from the elements, that was his, right? That property, that became his property. Whatever changes he imparted on nature that benefited or could benefit himself potentially, he has the rights to them to trade. If we break that relationship through printing money, capitalism it falls by the wayside. And then finally, capitalism, sort of as a consequence of its first two pillars, necessarily requires honest money or hard money or free market selected money. And that's what gold and silver were historically, and that's what Bitcoin is today. As we've covered repeatedly, the fiat currency that we call money today is actually just a tool of socialism, right? It's a political tool used to extract wealth, time, and labor from others. So I like to say that when we stop conceiving of central banking as an economic story and start to see it as a crime story, we're beginning to get the picture. And indeed, the wealth confiscated via fiat currency has been it's been the instrument of stealth funding for evil in the world, right? So if we look at the 20th century, there were about 169 million people murdered by the state, either through military, police, or other efforts. And this is it's a modern day mega atrocity that has actually its own name called democide. And when we stop to consider that every dictator, every world war, and every internment camp in history was funded by this stealth financing mechanism called fiat currency, via inflation, namely, we start to see that it is actually an instrument for evil. Not only does it pervert the free market forces that support, accurate prices, useful tools, and moral virtue in the marketplace, but it actually funds these war machines and other vehicles and organizations that are the most destructive things to life we've ever had. So it's really it's a really big deal. So Bitcoin in that sense, being disruptive to these fiat currency monopolies in a lot of ways, stands to benefit the world in a lot of ways that are really hard to conceive today. So history is really clear on this matter. The enforced enactment of the fiat currency lie, because it is a living lie, right? It was paper that was redeemable for money that was truthfully selected in the marketplace by freely acting market participants, suddenly is no longer redeemable for that money. So it is a token of deception. And the imposition of that deception on humanity has funded a loss of life on a monstrous scale, as we talked about earlier with democide. So I think a simple way to put this is that socialism, the model itself, where we could possibly expand the scope of this and call it just statism. Anything, this could be socialism, this could be communism, this could be fascism. Anytime the state introduces itself as the progenitor of a utopian situation, that they can come in and solve all the problems through taxation or through inflation or through whatever form of social organization that the demagogues of the time have concocted. That is a lie, right? Freely organizing people in a nonviolent free market is the best path to prosperity. We know that. We know that across all economic domains. And we also know that it maximizes wealth creation. And we know that wealth creation alleviates the pressures to conflict, right? Because there's not as much, people aren't in as dire of straits, right? People are better off. So there's less pressure to fight for scarce resources. So very simply, socialism is fraud. And central banking as an institution of socialism, those that remain silent, that see the truth of central banking and remain silent on this deceit, are frauds themselves. So the truth of money is that it's a social construct, right? Designed such that we can sacrifice time now to earn money, right? And then redeem that money later for similar sacrifices from others. So, and debt would be the opposite, right? Debt would be enjoying something now at the cost of later sacrifice, right? So money and debt are two opposite poles. And if we consider that money, the only way to extinguish a debt is with money. Debt is just a promise to pay money in the future, right? So the only way to settle that debt is to deliver money to the creditor and satisfy the debt. And in that way, like in this very sort of temporal perspective on money, we can see that fiat currency is oxymoronic to the concept of money, because fiat currency is born by borrowing, right? There is always a liability associated with fiat currency. And this liability is often realized by people that store their value in fiat, that suffer the impact of inflation, right? Or in more extreme cases, even hyperinflation, where we see prices of goods, doubling, tripling, quadrupling, or more in the course of days or weeks. And then even more severely, states have actually in the past deauthorized entire bills. So in India, there was a 500 rupee banknote that overnight was just declared no longer legal tender. So anyone had stored their wealth in a 500 rupee banknote, thought they had money, woke up the next day to suddenly realize that note as an asset was 100% liability, and that liability was fully realized when the issuer said it's no longer money. So that, to me, really paints the picture of why fiat currency is just, it doesn't work as money, right? It is debt. Its intrinsic nature is debt. And, as part of the social contract that is society, people must be able to reliably sacrifice time now to earn money that will be redeemable in the future. So there's a trust agreement made between people in the present and people in the future, either with themselves or with others. And when that intertemporal relationship breaks down, right? If I sacrifice now to earn money, and then find out in the future that it's no longer redeemable or that it's lost its value, then all of a sudden the fabric that holds us all together starts to unwind. It starts to unravel. This trust network that we've talked about and described, that is money, when that breaks down, society falls apart, right? And history is very clear on this, that the disintegration of money via inflation almost virtually always precedes total social collapse. So in that way, fiat currency, again, as this instrument of evil in the world, it's a tool of intergenerational dispossession. So we are stealing from our future selves, from our children, from future society to enjoy now and defer the cost of that later sacrifice that's demanded by economic reality, right, in the form of debt, pushing it onto others. So, and we're seeing that now, right? We're seeing the consequences of that now in real time. So it's really important to understand that we don't have money. We have debt in the world. So master and slave dynamics throughout history have almost always had a racial or cultural dynamic to them. And it seems that lately in the United States, this rash of police brutality against Black Americans has been just another manifestation of that. And the most recent murder of a civilian by a police officer, was the gentleman's name was George Floyd, and he was a 46-year-old man, and he was, as many of you may know, he's actually pinned down in broad daylight with a knee to the neck. There were a lot of onlookers there, many of which were recording video of the event, and he was pinned down for 9 minutes and with a knee to the neck and suffocated slowly. So all the while, citizens kind of onlooked helplessly. So it was a really especially brutal and sadistic murder, and done flagrantly in broad daylight. So to explain what's happened as a result of the George Floyd murder, I think it's important to remember again how the American pragmatists describe truth. And so the truth is the end of inquiry, right? So in the digital age, all of our windows of perception have been exponentially multiplied, right? We have laptops, phones, cameras, multiple devices per person in the world, people live streaming all the time, uploading things to the cloud, sharing, commenting, redistributing, et cetera, et cetera. So media as a tool has totally exploded, right? Almost, you have to operate now under the assumption in life that you're always being recorded, you're always being observed. And this, to me, what I identify this as is that through this multiplicity of media channels, the light of inquiry, right? There's just so much more visibility. People are able to peer into the reality of situations so much more pervasively and clearly and constantly, that truth actually surfaces more quickly. So I like to think in that sense that digital media is an accelerant to the truth-finding function of free markets. So free markets are forms of free exchange, everyone acquiring about the nature of themselves, their tools, their business models, their competitors, etc., trying to zero in on the truth, right? Prices, tools, virtue. And digital media is just like fuel on the fire, just totally sets the free market ablaze because it can form and iterate an inquiry so much more quickly, right? And zero in on truth so much more quickly. And what I think happened with George Floyd is that, there have been thousands of cases like George's where police have brutalized people, murdered them, cover-ups, et cetera, et cetera. But this one was set ablaze because it was streamed. First of all, it was especially brutal. Second of all, it was streamed on social media, right? And it set the world on fire. So the example I like to draw here is when in 1965, Martin Luther King led a group of protesters in Alabama. And at the time, the Alabama police basically, they clamped down on the peaceful protesters, and they started brutalizing them. They started beating these people just in the street very badly. And what was interesting is that this type, once again, this thing had these types of peaceful protests being beaten down by police officers had happened time and time before. But the difference with this Martin Luther King led protest in 1965 was that it was televised, right? So then all of a sudden, people, millions of people around the world watching police brutalize peaceful protesters in real time directly led to legislative reform here in the U.S., where we fixed, I think it was voting segregation and discrimination, right? So as media becomes more sophisticated and a better enhancer to visibility and transparency, I think markets are more able to zero in on truth more quickly, right? And we see change happen more and faster in the world. And that is the defining quality of the digital age, which is super interesting for money, as we'll talk about. So the truth about police is that their job is to keep the peace. And they're not even tasked with solving crimes. They're actually tasked with gathering evidence for the court, right? So, and actually, a lot of police patrols, ironically enough, began as slave patrols in the southern United States. So, such that when slaves would run away, police groups were organized to basically retrieve these runaway slaves and return them to their masters. So, police patrols in many places were established as the protectors of private property rights of slave masters. So it's an interesting relationship that today police also are just incentivized to maintain the peace while central banks and governments maintain their scheme of perpetual confiscation via inflation, right? So society's coming unraveled from this dilution of the monetary trust fabric. Police are there to try to keep the peace and keep things under control. And, you know, as the axiom goes, possession is 9/10 of the law. So I think that police, as what they actually are, is this group of militarized fact finders. They're really just nothing more than glorified government henchmen. So, as we've talked about with truth, it is the light of inquiry that melts away deception, lies, and bias to reveal truth. And that to me is the key reason central banking will fail in the digital age, because a currency counterfeiting operation like this that can steal vast swaths of human time, labor, and effort at scale will not persist. It cannot persist in this ever galvanizing gaze that's ever present in the digital age, right? Everyone's looking at everything. Everyone's evaluating, questioning everything. This perpetual digital-enabled inquisition has only been accelerated with the COVID pandemic. So I really think we're going to see these broken criminal institutions fall in our lifetimes. And to get back to George Floyd, which is really just a barbaric irony about this, is he was arrested for attempting to use a $20 counterfeit bill. And this is the same crime that the Federal Reserve perpetrates by the trillion, right? Every new dollar they print is the same thing as counterfeiting currency, because it's not redeemable for real money. They've arrogated themselves through deception and violence the right to monopolize the production of that bill, but that does not make the bill that they produce any more justified than the one George Floyd attempted to use. That was a counterfeit outside of the Federal Reserve System. So in the piece, I show some visualizations of what $10,000 looks like, up to a pallet. Basically, $10,000 is a small chunk of bills like this. A pallet of these, so if you can imagine a full pallet sitting next to me like a giant cube, is $100 million. And then if you imagine like a football field or more full of these pallets, that's $1 trillion. And in the past 5 months, the Federal Reserve has counterfeited $3 trillion again. And there's some great visuals in the piece about this. And I make a quote about it. So I say, quote, remember, society always slides towards slavery when a privileged few are able to produce money more cheaply than everyone else. As such, a free world is forever beyond reach before central banking is eliminated, unquote. So again, as sickening as it is ironic, George Floyd too was pressured by the prevailing economic system to counterfeit this $20 bill and try and use it to buy goods for himself because of the Fed's counterfeiting operation. And my argument there again is that the monetary standard that we operate under, as described with the parable of the winemaker earlier, it directly influences our moral standards, our moral character, right? So if we have a money like fiat currency that's premised on proof of theft, right? Every increase in USM2 money supply is value stolen from others by the monopolist. Then that imposes an incentive, or basically incentivizes people to steal, to rent seek, to deceive, to do anything to make ends meet because they're being robbed themselves. Whether they cognitively understand this or not, inflation is this infectious disease on our moral fabric. So in that sense, I think George Floyd was a victim of the Fed's currency counterfeiting operations. To respond to all of this, we have Bitcoin. And by buying Bitcoin and choosing to hold our savings in the immutable, unchangeable, unconfiscatable money supply that it represents, we are actually staging a peaceful protest against state-sponsored currency monopolies. And we're casting it in a vote that cannot be muted, right? So the votes that we're accustomed to going to make at the ballot box, choosing our representative, hoping they represent our best interest. I think by this point in reality, most people understand that that system doesn't work, right? Government as a localized affair and being involved in the local community, yes, you can make some changes on a certain level. You can influence culture. You can influence the allocation of funds to materially change kind of your local environment. But the further you get away from localized government, so the more federalized and top-heavy it is, the less that voting mechanism is effective. The only vote that always matters and cannot be ignored is how people spend their money. Because how you spend your money is how you spend your time and energy, right? And that is the bedrock of human organization. So when we choose to hold our savings in Bitcoin, we are reducing demand for fiat currency, and we are staging a peaceful protest against these currency monopolies. And we're doing it in a voice that cannot be distorted or muted, right? Because again, it's where we put our savings. And if it's placed in Bitcoin, no one can do anything about that. No one can distort your relative share of the Bitcoin money supply, right? If you hold 1,000 Bitcoin out of 21 million, you have a fixed percentage of that money supply that can only increase as other people lose coins, because no one can increase the supply past 21 million. So if we back up and we again consider and analogize free markets to these games that are played for the purpose of satisfying customer wants and discovering truth in the process, we can consider the Fed as basically an invincible opponent, right? Like a sports franchise that could just score points at the push of a button. And it's clear through this analogy that if there were a sports team like that, you would never watch sports, right? If there was a football team that could just score points by pressing a button, they would win every game, every season, every Super Bowl. It'd be lights out. That's what the Fed is doing, effectively. They are printing money to perpetually profit and siphon value off of everyone else, but not doing anything. They're not adding any value. They're just extracting it. They're like a vampire or a parasite, sucking the lifeblood out of the productive economy. And clearly, to face an opponent like that in sport would be the most demoralizing thing ever. You'd be like, what is the point in playing this game? This team just scores by pressing a button. So that's where we're at today. That's the frustration you'll hear if you talk to day traders, Um, they'll tell you flat out the philosophy is don't fight the Fed, because all they do is determine price action at the push of a button, right? The free market truth finding function has been all but broken. Like, it's been massively, massively distorted. Um, and we're going to live through the fallout of over a century of that market manipulation from the centralized currency counterfeiting operation that is the Federal Reserve. And Bitcoin, in that sense, um, it's breaking the central bank dominion over money, right? So, as such, it is an emancipatory force rising in the world. It is a technological, social, monetary institution breaking the chains and shackles that central banking has placed on the world. So back in the antebellum South, there was a group of intrepid people called abolitionists that were anti-slavery activists. And they supported escaping slaves by forming basically the Underground Railroad, that was this network of safe houses and pathways that helped runaway slaves escape from the South through the North into the free states of Canada. And there were, in this expedition to move north, there were many clues that helped them navigate. So, for instance, moss in certain places tends to grow on the north side of trees. So that would act as like a compass for them pointing north. Sometimes the northbound flight path of migrating birds could be an indicator of which direction to go. But perhaps the most important of these navigational instruments for escaping slaves in the southern U.S. were the stars, right? So the North Star. It is beyond the reach of man. It is hung in the heavens in a place that no one can change, no one can do anything about it, no one can block access to it. And it always indicates due north, right? So it's unchanged. It's the fact that it never changed in the night sky was the biggest navigational benefit to these escaping slaves. So most of the movement in the Underground Railroad was done at night, right? They would use the cover of darkness to escape and protect themselves. And it's also when the stars were out. So this North Star became a true lodestar in the sense that it was lighting their path to liberty, right? It literally pointed the way to escape bondage. And the Underground Railroad that assembled itself during that time was basically this open network, right, of volunteers operating covertly, using different signs and signals of when and how to move people. A lot of people really, facing the onslaught of the state, right? If they were caught by these police patrols or anyone else trying to enforce and recapture the runaway slaves, that they faced a lot of punishment themselves. And it was anti-slavery activists like Harriet Tubman that led this volunteer network. There was again a series of safe houses and whatnot, and it was this volunteer organization that actually started to break down and erode the institution of slavery in pre-Civil War America. So in the modern age, under the Fiat financial slavery imposed upon us by the Fed, we once again find hope from escaping this form of bondage in an open source network. Um, Bitcoin is this volunteer programmed clandestine technology, basically, that's freely accessible to the world. And it's guided by what I like to call is its own North Star, and that is the immovable number of 21 million, right? Just like that North Star was hung high in the sky, beyond the reach of slave masters and anyone else who would attempt to to extinguish it or blot it out or distort it. The quantity of 21 million Bitcoin is so firmly planted in the consciousness of everyone who uses it. And it's been hardened through hostility, right? During the fork wars, when there have been a lot of forks off of Bitcoin, won't go into the detail, but a lot of people thought that would be dilutive to this 21 million and we'd have thousands of competing Bitcoins. But what's been proven time and time again in the market is that the one original Bitcoin with a supply of 21 million has outshined all of the other competing monies, right? To the point where it's not even a contest. If you look at the freely circulating supply, Bitcoin has like a 90+% dominance in the marketplace. So it's about having something that's beyond the reach of man that makes it immune to our inevitable politicking, our greed, our corruption, all these things that cause us, this sinful nature, if you will, that causes us to corrupt the institutions and the things that we operate with. We need things that are beyond our own reach to save ourselves. And the North Star was an example of that in pre-Civil War America and guiding runaway slaves to freedom. And Bitcoin's supply of 21 million, firmly fixed in a way that no human can change it forever, is a lodestar guiding fiat slaves out of the bondage of central banking. So I'd like to read you this piece toward the conclusion of the essay. And I say that we are all living witnesses to the incineration of institutional falsity by unstoppable, honest money. Bitcoin is a burning star of sincerity, engulfing the enforced fiction of fiat currencies everywhere. From the ashes of this phoenix immolation, a society structured on the sound principles of accountability, honor, and integrity can arise. As an implementation of absolutely truthful money, Bitcoin is a luminous beacon that cannot be coerced or concealed. As Buddha taught us, quote, 3 things cannot be long hidden: the sun, the moon, and the truth, unquote. So in this sense, I consider Bitcoin to be one of the greatest capitalist technologies that's ever existed. And it's giving rebellion to the institution of socialism that is dominant in the heart of the world today, which is the central bank. It's a peaceful revolution, right? And it involves the permanent disarmament of tyrants that weaponize monetary systems to inflict wealth inequality and steal time. So Bitcoin itself is what I've called before is a weapon of peace, right? What I mean by that is that it's a tool for assassinating time theft. It's a tool for saving mankind from himself by stopping him from robbing his future self, right, through fiat currency. And again, whether or not Bitcoin actually is the philosopher's stone that's been talked about for thousands of years, the incorruptible substance that would save us from state tyranny, I guess the verdict's still out on that one. But I do think it's extremely interesting how much intellectual gravity, how much financial gravity, how much philosophical gravity Bitcoin exhibits. The people that it pulls into this space are some of the most independent, intelligent, and compassionate people I've ever seen. And I actually not only have lived through, but also witnessed it engender changes in other people's lives, right? Where interacting with this funny new internet money called Bitcoin somehow changes you, makes you think longer term, makes you be more conscious of your community and your environment, makes you more prone to save. It's overall lowering your time preference and thereby extending your concern for the world in the future. So I'll just finish with a little excerpt from the piece here. Said, as a purely honest free market money, Bitcoin is an irrepressible truth, an expression of pure monetary capitalism and a modern-day declaration of independence for fiat slaves worldwide. Bitcoin is money without masters, a system governed by rules instead of rulers. By awakening the world from the nightmare of financial slavery, Bitcoin is a dream of freedom coming true. So I hope you guys enjoyed that. This is, again, my latest piece, Masters and Slaves of Money. It's available on Medium, and I would love to hear your feedback. Um, I, I'm really deeply philosophically aligned with this movement and what it represents, and I consider this to be my life's work. So I hope you find some benefit in this. I hope you'll study Bitcoin more closely. I hope you'll keep following that rabbit down the rabbit hole, asking yourself the question, what is money? Just relentlessly asking yourself that question and see how far it takes you. But that's it for now. Thank you so much, and I look forward to seeing you again soon. Hey guys, this is Robert Breedlove from Deep Conversations. I hope you found this content we've been putting out insightful, useful, enjoyable. And if you do, I'd like you to go out and subscribe to our YouTube channel. Consider signing up for our Patreon page, which is linked in our YouTube banner. Or consider sending us some sats to our Bitcoin address, which is in the description to this video. I am extremely grateful for all of the outreach, all the messages, all the love and support you guys have sent our way as we continue to try and bring truth back to the world. And on that topic, I'd like to encourage you to keep asking yourself and encourage you to ask others to ask themselves that very poignant and important question: what is money? Just keep asking yourself that question and see what truth you find. All right? Thanks.